a little punch drunk. Forgive us if we're a little sluggish today. We're happy but sluggish. I will call to order public meeting number 87, Thursday, October 31st, 2013, of the Massachusetts Gaming Commission at the Boston Convention Center. First issue is item 2, the approval of minutes. Commissioner McHugh.
The minutes, Mr. Chairman, are in the book. I circulated them yesterday, although they may have been in the book before that. But in any event, if everybody's had a chance to read them, I would move that they be approved in the form contained in the book. And if not, if everybody hasn't had a chance to read them, we could do it next meeting.
I would just compliment Mr. Statnoff for the minutes. I mean, it's really help. If people are trying to follow what we're doing in terms of creating a record that's usable, this is great. You know, we didn't write pages and pages and pages of everything, but you draw everybody's attention to the things that are critical. And it's part of the transparency effort, and it's a lot of work. And I appreciate it, but it's good.
And it's a great key into the substantive stuff for people who are interested in particular issues. So.
I would second
Okay,
the
good.
approval of the minutes.
Any further discussion? All in favor? That
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Passes unanimously. That was a motion for me, sort of vaguely. I told you sluggish this morning. All right. Director Jill from Workforce Supplier and Diversity Development Report.
Good morning, Chairman, Commissioners.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. You may recall that on October 7th, I appeared before you regarding the need to adopt a definition for the phrase small business that is found in the Act establishing expanded gaming in the Commonwealth. And I'm here today to recommend a specific definition. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about the goal and describe the public comment period that we went through. So to remind you that the goal of adopting a specific definition for small business is to ensure that the policy objectives of Chapter 23K to positively impact small business is realized. And to clarify for the benefit of our licensee applicants that the legislation placed on ensuring small business receive the positive economic impacts as a result of the Expanded Gaming Act. But I also want to note, it's also important to note that the goal is not to negatively impact larger businesses, but rather to have applicants think about policies and procedures that do not rule out smaller businesses in Massachusetts. 85.5% of the businesses across the state are less than 20 employees. So, yes. So we put 2 definitions out for public comment. And in your packet, there is information about the 2 options. One was 50 employees or less, and the other was a larger threshold of 100 employees or less. And during the public comment period, which we extended for, it was a period of 2 weeks, we received 10 responses with relatively equal support for the 2 proposals. The recommendation definition of 50 employees or less received slightly higher support with 5 responses. Most respondents agreed that the federal small business definition of up to 500 employees inadequately captured the Massachusetts economy. 2 individuals did support retaining that definition, however. So we received public comments from across the state and from small business entities like the National Federation of Independent Businesses, the Economic Development Council of Western Massachusetts, the Office of Small Business and Entrepreneurship for the state, the Minority Business Development Agency, the Center for Women in Enterprise, the Newmarket Business Association, and the Massachusetts Supplier Diversity Office. So we had, the Chamber of Commerce of Greater Springfield and Harpoon Brewery, to name a few. So I am before you recommending that we adopt the definition, a small business shall be defined as 50 or fewer full-time employees having its principal place of business in Massachusetts, having been in business at least 1 year, and having gross revenues of 15 million or less based on a 3-year average. And so this is consistent with definitions used by the Office of Supplier Diversity for their small business purchasing program, and also used for the small business health insurance program that the state offers.
I have a couple of questions.
Yeah, please.
What do we mean by, the second bullet of the definition of small business combined? Employees are combined.
Okay, what we mean is if a business has multiple locations across the state, or, that those locations combined, we combine the total of their employees. And we're not looking just, for example, at one location, we're looking at all of their locations. We're interested in the general size of the business.
So it
The
has nothing to
total-
do with, say, part-time, full-time employees, for example?
Actually, so we're looking for the combined total of employees, of full-time employees in all of their locations, all entities, yes.
And what about subcontractors? Sometimes some of these contracts are, laid out to a main entity that itself goes out and hires subcontractors. For example, it could be a national entity whose developers are based in Massachusetts, and that could be a good mechanism to get credit for employing Massachusetts-based small businesses. Have we thought about, we wouldn't want to
Right.
confuse that subcontracting relationship and combine
Right.
the two
We would.
numbers.
No, we
wouldn't
would support the subcontracting situation that you mentioned, and we're not intending to count those subcontractor employees as in this definition. So we would encourage subcontracting to smaller firms.
I think the point about combined is a little you might say combined parents, all sites or something like that, all
Okay.
locations or something like that. Because I agree with Commissioner Zuniga that it's a little confusing, a little
Okay.
unclear what that means.
Okay, so, so we will revise it combined at all locations.
And although not explicit here, if we could, again, later on adopt or be mindful that the subcontracting relationship is an important tool to get contracts let out, and also at the same time get credit for employing small business. I think that's an important consideration for us.
I agree with you, Commissioner. I think the subcontracting relationship fulfills many goals of the legislation, including contracting with minority business,
Yes.
with small business, so we'll make sure to clarify that.
Right.
And we'll post this definition on the website when it's final.
So when you're saying, sorry,
So,
so when you're saying credit, you mean if if a big company hires,
Subcontractors.
so if we award, or a bidder awards a contract to a contractor,
Yep.
and they have subcontractors
correct.
that qualify as small businesses,
That's
that should somehow be,
Counted.
yeah, okay.
I'll give you a great example, one that I think we're going to talk about it a little bit more, that we're going through ourselves. Somebody could hire Microsoft to do a big implementation of a big contract, let's say, a big software implementation. Microsoft sells the software, and then by necessity, they need to have developers customize it and implement it or integrate it with other things. So they themselves use a lot of contractors. Those subcontractors could be, say, here, and there ought to be a credit for the fact that that mechanism is implemented with support for small business locally, as an example.
Yeah, okay, good, I agree.
Great.
What is the purpose of the 1-year requirement?
So we adopted this definition to be consistent because it is the same definition that the state uses for the small business purchasing program. But the intent really is if a business has been in business for a year, it's stable, it's,
Okay, I get that, but on the other hand, this is a brand-new industry, and it is conceivable, is it not, that the promise of contracts, the promise of work, the promise of jobs that this is supposed to stimulate might cause people to form businesses to take advantage of that, particularly small businesses, and particularly in areas where there are underemployed groups. I don't know that any of that is so, but
well,
would
that's
we
actually
want to
a
exclude
good
that?
point. That's actually a really good point. There are some areas, for example, in the gaming area, I don't know of many slot repair companies, and so there could be an instance, you're right, where an existing entity or two entities combined form a new business, or,
Well,
so that is right.
so sorry if it sounds very self-congratulatory, but this is where the subcontracting relationship could be helpful. If somebody is a subcontractor with not with 1 year of experience to someone else, they could, by virtue of being a subcontractor, develop up the 1 year experience and ultimately later be contracted directly. Joint ventures you alluded to are also helpful in this matter.
But just take an example of, it's not, I think, far-fetched. A chef who's working for somebody else now sees this as an opportunity to start her own restaurant
For catering business.
or catering business, and gets 5 or 6, 10 people together, wants to start this, go after a casino gig. I just would hate
Well,
to
you could-
exclude those people. I
Well,
don't know.
They could, all you would do is exclude them from being credited as a small business.
That's right. I mean, they could still do
They
it,
can still do it, they can still get the business, yeah,
but they get an edge for being a small business.
right.
If we didn't have the 1 year, though, couldn't others who have a relationship with some of these, excuse me, applicants or licensees quickly come to Massachusetts, put a business together because they know they don't have to be here for a year, and end up getting credit as well? If they have a business in another jurisdiction, they could come here, they have a relationship with the, so that, I think the 1 year could help us, that we know they're here. They didn't just come in and start the business, and there would be no ability to say, okay, you meet the every other piece of this, but, you're not here for a year. So I would worry, and I know that does happen sometimes. People come in from other jurisdictions because they know there's opportunity. So I think it could work both ways. Your point is well taken as well,
Yeah,
that,
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And I think this also sort of precludes the sort of phony throwing together of a venture, you know, let's kind of pretend, you know, like say Joe and quick take out papers. And it also becomes less and less a problem as time goes by. We're adopting regs which are going to last for the next 100 years. You know, it's this first year that's much more of an issue than it would be over time. I kind of lean towards leaving it in as a sort of a stabilizing factor, but I don't feel terribly strongly about it. Commissioner Stebbins, yeah, do you have a
Yeah, first of all, I think Jill did a pretty thorough, diligent job reaching out to a lot of the partners that we're pulling into this effort. You know, I think the definition is we have it laid out. Again, it's not being designed to deter our applicants away from doing business with larger companies in Massachusetts. But I think it gives us protection that our applicants can't say, well, we did go out and recruit several small businesses to work with us, and they all have 400 to 500 employees. I think people would scoff at that notion that they were actually working with small businesses. So this, I think the definition as she has it, I appreciate the comments about, you know, the contractors, but I think the definition as it's lined up in this initial startup period will really give our applicants some pause and make them think strategically about working with Massachusetts companies that are already here. I think to Commissioner Cameron's point, it gets us away from people who see an opportunity come in from other states. But I think it gives us a solid direction for our applicants to take in terms of saying we're going to make an all-out effort to work with small businesses and get credit for those that have already been here in Massachusetts and certainly are looking to benefit from the potential business relationship.
So you're in favor of leaving the 1 year?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think the intent of the legislation to positively impact homegrown Massachusetts businesses was part of the thinking of leaving in the 1 year. Having a principal place of Massachusetts, place of business in Massachusetts, we're really looking to benefit those who are here currently, so.
Do we need a vote on this?
Well, as a matter of fact, we're having some discussion as we move forward, but I think it would be, at least from my perspective, it would be a step to adopt it, at least initially, as a definition, but we were thinking that we probably need to move it into our regulations as we move forward, because it would define the term in the statute. And then the commission could actually revisit it, so.
Okay. So the answer was yes, we do, okay.
Yes.
Thank you. So are we ready? Do you have more to say, Commissioner McHugh, on?
No, I have no facts, so.
Can we refer to the statute about this somehow or other? Somebody want to put this into the form, Commissioner Stebbins, do you want to?
Sure. I move that the commission adopt the definition for a small business as outlined in the recommendation from our Director of Workforce Supply and Diversity Development as stated.
Second?
Second.
Commissioner Stebbins, I think the commission did agree that we will add all locations
After combined.
after.
Right.
Yep,
Would you amend your motion?
I
So-
do.
So amended?
I do.
And include, not necessarily in the definition, but consideration relative to subcontracting relationships.
Further discussion? All in favor of adopting as written with that amendment? Aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Ayes have it unanimously. Okay?
Okay, and I'm also here before you today to give you a brief update on the subject of diversity and inclusion. Commissioners and Chairman Crosby, as you know, diversity and inclusion is a priority for the commission. And the importance of diversity and inclusion has been emphasized through the legislation, both on the workforce and vendor side of things, through the regulations, and also diversity and inclusion has been woven throughout the application questions and various topics. Including emphasizing and asking applicants for a workforce development plan and a diversity plan. The application asks applicants regarding minority equity and leadership within their organization. So I wanted to also just give you an update that we have invited a group to appear at the next public meeting on November 7th that will focus on supplier diversity. And in your packet is a letter. The signatories include the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council, the New England Area Conference of the NAACP, the Mass Minority Contractors Association, the Mass Business Development Association, the Business Center in Boston, the Center for Women in Enterprise, the Urban League, and the Hispanic American Chamber of Commerce. So they have been invited and requested a chance to talk to the commission and the applicants and general public about supplier diversity, and they're interested in highlighting best practices. So I wonder, I'll highlight that we've been working closely with the Mass Community Colleges and the career centers and others regarding workforce development and ensuring that the workforce will be diverse, we hope. And I have contacted applicants about a November 15th supplier diversity conference that takes place in Fenway Park in Boston, and it's sponsored by some of the signatories of this letter. So I thought I'd give you a chance to ask questions if you have them.
Yeah, I have a couple too. The point that Commissioner McHugh was making, in my opinion, applies perhaps a little bit more heightened to the notion of MBE participation, especially when we're thinking about being MBE or WBE certified. So the certification is perhaps a higher threshold, and I know there's a lot of requirements and forms that businesses have to subscribe by and prove in order to be certified. So how do we ensure that there's a pipeline of minority businesses that can benefit from this?
So we have clarified to applicants, applicants asked for clarification regarding some of the application questions, and we have clarified to applicants that the businesses need to be certified, minority businesses specifically through the Office of Supplier Diversity or the Greater New England Minority Supplier Development Council. But events like the upcoming event at Fenway Park that call businesses together and offer a chance for businesses to actually be certified by those agencies, and by sponsoring business fairs and so forth. And that's something I think the commission will, working with some of these entities, be able to do in the near future. But it's vitally important that businesses who qualify actually get certified. because it's incumbent, on them to do so.
I think it's important to note, I mean, not only have the signatories on this letter given us a lot to think about in terms of how we can make sure the goals of the statute are being met, but that all of them have put themselves forward as resources to the applicants to assist them in meeting their MBE and WBE goals. I would also, I think it's important to note that the statute also talked about outreach to veteran-owned businesses, which is more of a, I don't want to call it a recent phenomena, but has gained a lot more interest and focus since the wars overseas and our men and women from the armed services coming back. It's been tougher to identify, define those resources that are available to assist with our applicants with finding veteran-owned businesses. And the recent government shutdown didn't help because canceled a couple of calls that you and I had, but let's make sure that we keep our focus on that as well.
Right. And I'll just mention that our vendor advisory board includes many of the organizations that I've already mentioned, in addition to Veterans Affairs and the SBA veteran contact. So I just want to actually correct a date that I mentioned. The date of the 5th Annual Business Opportunity Expo is November 21st at Fenway Park, not the 15th. So let the record show that.
Mr. Director, yeah, what do we think relative to the goals that are here referenced in the first bullet? I mean, we could take a page from the Public Works goals that are in other statutes. Are we thinking of a specific number?
So
10% and 50%, I forget the exact numbers for Public Works, NB and
The
WB
state.
participation. But is that what we're thinking about?
So the legislation refers specifically to goals during construction. And I don't have those numbers, but it's in the administrative bulletin number 14, and it's, I think it's 16 point something for minority. And there's also a goal for women. And yes, we have talked about that. We've posted that bulletin on our website. We are in discussion regarding regulations, but we haven't come out with a specific definition or a goal during operations.
Okay.
So,
Also, the fourth bullet, implement an internal infrastructure to ensure adequate compliance
And rigorous enforcement. What do we mean, what do the signatories mean by that?
So I think the signatories are concerned with applicants meeting their promises and, ensuring that.
I am too, but what do we mean by the infrastructure? We are too, we
Okay.
all are as well. But what do we mean by that infrastructure?
Oh, an identified individual to, to check and enforce that those goals are met. And I think
We're
that's
looking at
something
them.
we're looking at, right.
No, we're looking at her.
But I think additionally, we're talking about construction compliance as well, and I think the commission is considering that as well. So,
I am fully in favor of this, and this is a critically important part of our exercise, but enforcement and penalties has the appearance of converting goals into quotas, and I think we have to be very careful to keep that in mind. It's one thing, I think, to penalize the failure to engage in an effort, and another thing to penalize failing to achieve a result. And I think in today's sort of uncertain environment, we have to keep that in mind as we vigorously push forward with this effort, which is an important part and has been from the beginning of our overall undertaking.
I know I had a conversation with Director Acosta about this very issue, and he believes the licensing system will be able to, we can, put the fields in place that we'll be able to track this information, and we will have this information in real time. And I believe that when people know you're looking and you're collecting the data, they do pay attention more to meeting the goals. So I think us having that information in real time will assist us in letting the licensees know that it's important, and we want them to take it seriously.
And although we haven't finalized and are in the beginning stages of talking about the regulations, regular reporting of many of these issues is something that the commission can require. And, whether it's quarterly, for example, in Pennsylvania, they publish diversity reports and put them up on their website on a quarterly basis. So, that's something that the commission could entertain. The other thing that we have this vendor advisory group. Many of the individuals on this group are experts in the best practices in terms of supplier diversity. And we could potentially use this group to review those reports and take a look at whether the best efforts are really being used. So.
Are others? Our moment of greatest leverage is right now, obviously, relative to the Category 1s. Category 2 applications are in. They have done what they have on this. We are evaluating them as we speak, but the Category 1 are still to come. So I'm not exactly sure, how much you have linked up with, particularly Commissioner Stebbins, the Economic Development Group, the evaluation group, so that we are looking to see who will propose real meat, like some of these recommendations are. Is that where are you two in making sure that the evaluation criteria have real bite to it?
Well, it's certainly something that we're considering during the application process for the Category 2, but also, I think by inviting groups in, like the one on November 7th, will highlight the importance. But it is something that we're discussing. We have planned on November 12th. Many of these, actually, I think all of these individuals have been invited to review regulations to ensure that recommended or draft licensing regulations don't impact small businesses negatively, unintendedly. We will talk to the groups about this, but it is something that we're considering also in the application phase as well.
Yeah, and we just need the applicants to know that the more specific and the more aggressive these are, the more credit they're going to get in the evaluation. And once they're in the applications, then we can hold people accountable for what they've committed to. So the less warm and fuzzy and the more specific the evaluation and the analysis can be, the better it is. We also, in the overview section, in my section, and I'm not sure whether it appears in some of the economic development ones as well, we asked the applicants, as you mentioned, about whether what is the diversity in the makeup of their leadership structure and ownership structure. And that goes a long way to giving some reliability in the warm and fuzzy part where they're saying we're going to do this, that, and the other thing. Because I think, and our own experience demonstrates this, that if you have a diverse leadership structure and ownership structure, then per force you're going to have diversity within your employer base and your supplier base, because your leadership teams understands the value of having a multiple and diverse perspective on things. In our own experience, we have one of our commissioners who was born in another country and who is bilingual and who has helped us make smarter decisions, better, more informed decisions about a lot of things that we deal with. And it happens from time to time. And it's a perspective we would not have if we didn't have Commissioner Zuniga part of this team. So I just want to reinforce that and make sure that you're reinforcing that. You know, there's a link between leadership and ownership and performance on these critical variables that we care about. So I just wanted to emphasize that and make sure that you're emphasizing that as well. One other thing, which is a different topic, but I spoke at the Cape Cod Community College yesterday, and one of the groups that was attending my talk was the casino management class, which is being offered for the first time, which is great. You know, that's exactly what this was all about, was, you know, economic development and new job generation. But also the students in Cape Cod Community College represent in one aspect of the target audiences that we're trying to reach, the harder to employ, the underemployed, the under-resourced workforce market. And they brought up the issue of Corey credit and drug testing. And they are aware of those issues and how that can become a barrier to accomplishing the public policy objective that's set out in targeting these kinds of workforce groups. So I know you're working on this, but again, this is something where we really need to wrestle hard. I know, you know, with Director Acosta, you're talking about this too, but how are we going to draw these lines? How are we going to protect the integrity of our facilities on the one hand, but not make it impossible to accomplish other public policy objectives of reaching important demographic groups? So I just wanted to throw that out there too, and remind you and Director Acosta and everybody that we need to make some careful, thoughtful, nuanced decisions about how we can manage those checks to accomplish those two not necessarily compatible objectives.
So one of the things that we're doing is Director Acosta and also Deputy Counsel Grossman and I have hosted workforce stakeholders, members of the community colleges, the local unions, and nonprofits that work with the underemployed, unemployed, talking to them about the requirements of the legislation and also potential licensing regulations. And so we're making sure that we get feedback early on, and we can certainly discuss this later on, but I think that's certainly the intent of the commission and of the staff as well.
Great. Other issues, questions, comments for Director Whiffen?
I don't have any other issue, but I just did want to reinforce the comments you made a minute ago, Mr. Chairman, about the importance of diversity in the leadership. There is, in the current issue of Commonwealth Magazine, there's a long article about this that's worth reading, worth everybody reading. And the nexus between a diverse leadership and a diverse employee group and a diverse supplier group is clear. And it's critically important, something that I'm going to be looking for, and I think all of us are going to be looking for as we review the applications, to pay attention to that. We're spending a lot of time rightly on the workforce development, on the supplier development, the diversity of that, but having a diverse leadership is probably the best way to ensure that goals are pursued relentlessly and with enthusiasm and creatively. So I think we'll all be looking for that.
Great.
Well, I think the commission has made it clear that diversity is important at all levels, from, you know, the rank and file employees all the way up to the top. So thank you for clarifying that for our applicants and for the public.
Okay, anything else? Thank you, Director.
Thank you.
And now, item 4, Administration, Executive Director Day.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, I think I just can't resist, I have to start off with a congratulations to the Red Sox.
Thank you.
And then, of course, a happy Halloween wish to the commission as well.
Thank you.
And you know what I'm about to say, but I thought it was worth mentioning because it puts it all in perspective in short of one sentence. But since our last meeting, the commission has held 3 public input meetings, a responsible gaming forum, a gaming policy advisory meeting, a suitability hearing, and a special meeting of the commission. Besides that, and General Counsel Blues stepped in and held 3 initial horse racing licensing hearings in preparation for consideration by the commission on November 7th. So I think congratulations are in order for maintaining that pace.
That was a
through
busy
this
2
process.
weeks.
And
And the World Series.
and we had to read a very large report.
Yes.
A 900
900
page
suitability
report.
report.
Right. So
Yes.
we're congratulating ourselves.
Are we taking credit for the Red Sox win, too? Is that what
No,
you're suggesting?
I think we should.
Absolutely.
It's all about teamwork.
And so that's, and partially it's set up for our November 7th meeting, which will be here, of course, again at the convention center. And one of the items that will be on that is the racing licensing hearings. Since our last meeting, though, I want to update the commissioners just on a few things. And since our last meeting, our Chief Financial and Accounting Officer, Derek Glennon, and our Chief Information Officer, John Glennon, have joined our staff. They've been very busy, and I think you probably all had some exposure to them moving around very rapidly in their short time here. Derek has hired a fiscal analyst to join our staff and to replace Bill Curtis. Bill, as you know, was a key member of the fiscal staff, and we were fortunate that he selected to move into licensing as a supervisor. I wish him the best in that section. He's done great for the commission so far. In addition, Derek is developing key financial policies and preparing to play a role in our plan to present a quarterly budget report November 7th. So we look forward to that. John, as well, has jumped in to guide our acquisition of the document management and licensing system. We'll hear more from John here a little later. While he is developing a schedule, though, to visit several gaming labs, which is a critical step to our process in developing electronic gaming equipment standards and approval process as we move toward our discussion of that topic in early December. That's our target, I guess I would say at this point. I just want to note, too, Trupti Band, our Human Resources Manager, of course, started just in early October, has been completed training with state HR, and among other daily tasks, she has also been working with directors and has actually drafted and proposed staffing needs and position descriptions to support that here as we move forward. I'll be discussing that with her in more detail as we get into next week. And of course, our Investigations and Enforcement Bureau is working to conclude our 3 remaining casino license suitability investigations by mid-December. I would like to take just a minute to make some introductory comments about a couple of the items on our agenda as we move forward. And thanks to Director Acosta and his team in licensing, and of course Deputy Counsel Grossman, we have an initial draft of proposed licensing regulations in the commission packet. I will join David and Todd for discussion, the first review of these drafts with the commission. Between now and the commission meeting on November 7th, we plan discussion and additional revisions, so we're ready to request approval to move forward with the formal process, if at all possible, on November 7th. And of course, the commission is aware we're marching forward to try to accommodate the process requirements, plus our ability to have effective regulations as we project to begin licensing in at least around mid-January. In addition, we have discussion here for you today, recommendation information regarding our acquisition of the document content management and licensing systems. Our procurement teams have identified their successful proposals, and we have some initial cost estimates. These systems are the backbone of our operational infrastructure, and to that degree, we look forward to the discussion, and of course, I'm requesting that the Commission consider delegating us the ability to negotiate the final contract and work to get us operational by mid-January. Wanted to briefly touch on those before we got involved in our discussion here later. With that side, I'd like to refer the commissioners, if I may, unless there's any questions on those areas, to tab 4B.
Let me just, before you do, the last time we talked at length about the master schedule, and you made some decisions about what you were going to target as the day we have to be ready for operations, and then you were going to ripple that back through all the other critical path categories. Where are you in giving us a final interim critical path chart?
I anticipate actually scheduled to meet with our consultant tomorrow morning, and so we'll continue the process there. And as long as we're here, what I am leaning toward is working toward a schedule that involves a deadline of about 6 months after award.
Right. And by the 7th, would you have a new master schedule that we could look at where the impact of that on everything would have been rippled back?
I should at least, we should be able to at least
That would be-
take an initial look at that, so
I think
I'll just
that-
add that to the agenda.
That would be really helpful, and as you know, that surfaces scary points when you do that. So, and you were adding in a couple of other categories. You were adding, I think, supplier development or workforce development, or and also the problem gambling.
Correct, and we've actually, Jill has met, and we've got supplier development added to the chart already. I'm in the process of looking over what we have there.
Okay.
And I know we've submitted additional information as well on problem gambling. Hopefully we'll have at least an activity line started for that at this point.
Okay, well, it'd be great if we could see that the night before the 7th and have a chance to talk about that on the 7th.
Well, the goal will have it in the packet.
Right. All right. Great, thank you.
Any other questions on those? General administration. What I'd like to do is refer you to the recommendation in the packet. This is the item as reflected on the agenda relative to general consulting contracts. And I won't go through the entire recommendation, but I think it's important just to note some points covered in that recommendation. As you may recall, we amended this, our general consulting contract on August 16th, 2013. The idea was to reduce the retainer and require a quarterly review services under the contract. Since then, we have been only able to review some preliminary information, but based on what we've seen and the apparent activity under the consulting retainer, we propose to further amend the contract as follows. Beginning November 1, we'll eliminate the monthly retainer described in the agreement. Commissioner Zuniga and I will replace Eileen Glowski as the Commission Project Manager. We will work under the general consulting contract needs to be reviewed internally by either Commissioner Zuniga or myself prior to initiation. The services will go basically from the current retainer level to those supported by a scope of services and in particular an hourly rate as well. The idea under this recommendation is that the hourly rate will just be standardized around the hourly rate used for investigation services at this point. And the consultants have been notified about the proposed change, and where we had the ability to, we have had discussions about that with the consultants. The other point I would make is once the commissioners actually take action on this, which hopefully will this morning, I think it's important for us, Commissioner Zuniga and I and Derek, to kind of work together and then circulate a guide really to staff about future consultant commitments so that we make sure that our necessarily rapid as we move forward and make sure that we're aware of what's being asked and what the at least estimates are of those services as we move forward.
Can I make a couple of general
Yeah,
comments?
sure, anything.
I think this gives us flexibility. You know, I'm not entirely sure that we will end up needing both sets of consulting, gaming consulting contracts, but nonetheless, given the framework that you recommend, allows us the ability to, you know, based on scope prior to engaging, prior to a go-ahead, you know, to analyze where or who or how long it's going to take. So I think it's a good recommendation, and I'm glad that we're moving forward in a more cost-effective manner now that we have more staff and many other consultants as well, by the way. So.
The guidelines or the thing that you are planning to circulate for staff with respect to how to interface with the consultants would apply to the commissioners as well, I take it.
That would be my recommendation and why there's the combination of Commissioner Zuniga, myself, and Derek
All right.
trying to come forward with these requirements. And I think it's important that we really, to the best we can, we touch all three areas, is the general contract, the investigative contract, and the evaluation team expenses as well.
But I'm not sure this is what you were getting at, but one of the real benefits of having these consultants on board, particularly early on, but it's continued throughout, has been our ability to turn to them at a moment's notice and get them to either just get on the phone and give us advice about something, or to do real quick turnaround projects. And as Commissioner Zuniga was talking to me about this, it was clear that this will not preclude that, and it's important. Some of us, I know, particularly Commissioner Cameron, likes to do outreach, and this will not preclude that. If we need to pick up the phone and get some expertise, they can simply keep track of how long they talk us and bill it for that. If there are real work products that aren't, you know, immediate, time sensitive, where you really want them to do a little project, it's perfectly appropriate to give them a couple of lines scope at least, and a few lines scope, and get a bid back or a proposal back or an estimate back what it's going to cost, which is entirely appropriate. But that's not incompatible with the kind of use we've made of these folks going forward.
No, and I wasn't suggesting otherwise.
No, I know, I was
but
reinforcing what you said, yeah.
But I do think it's important as we move forward to keep track on an ongoing, real-time basis of what we're asking them to do at all levels, at our level as well as everybody else's. So,
Right.
just so
Yeah,
we have control over.
This is absolutely the right way to go, and it's just one in many examples of us trying to, systematize now that we're beginning to mature a little bit, beginning to flesh out a little bit, beginning to get full staffed. We're professionalizing and standardizing our operations, and it makes all the sense in the world.
Any other questions or suggestions as we move forward?
No, do we need a vote to, I mean, we have an existing contract amendment that takes us through in terms of time extension. I don't know that we need a vote for this.
I think we need a vote because we would actually go forward and we'd leave the timeline in, but we would amend the contract as we did before.
Okay, do you want to, Commissioner Zuniga, do you know what the vote would be?
Sure, I can try to put it together based on this memo, but I would recommend that this commission authorize Director Day and myself to execute amendment to the existing contracts with our gaming consultants on an as-needed basis, based on a scope to be determined prior to each of those amendments, and continue an hourly rate in case of miscellaneous tasks.
Second.
Any further discussion?
Has this been taken up with the consultants? Are they aware that this is going to happen effective tomorrow?
Yes, it has been taken up with the consultants.
And are they in agreement with this? Or is that yet to be worked out, the details yet to be worked out?
I would say yes, they are.
Okay.
You know, this is, I think transferring this, the implementation of this and these kinds of stuff to our new Chief Financial and Administrative Officer ASAP, and we want Commissioner Zuniga out of it as soon as possible, and we really want you out of it as soon as possible. And this is the kind of thing that we can pretty soon delegate down, I think, to our new CFAO.
Mr. Chairman, as a matter of fact, he was involved in this
Right.
recommendation.
Right. Good. Any further discussion on the motion? All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? The ayes have it unanimously.
Thank you. I believe that's all I have for this morning. I believe that brings us to the licensing.
Item number 5, Licensing Division, Director Acosta.
Good morning, Commissioners.
Morning.
Morning.
Good morning.
Before you is a draft, and I must emphasize the word draft, of the licensing regulations. This is the initial, and hopefully we can work from this document going on forward. This document was put together with the assistance of the legal staff and the executive director. It is a document that will have some significant implications in licensing, in the data management system, and how we're going to do business from this point on forward. I cannot emphasize enough that this is a draft. There will be some changes, obviously, that will be made. This is a starting point, and we're here to present and hopefully start a discussion as it relates to the licensing regulations.
Good morning.
Morning.
We thought it would be helpful to present this to you here today so you could get a flavor of the direction this is taking. We could take any input, and the hope was over the course of the next week we could meet individually. In fact, David and myself and Rick and Catherine hope to meet with certain of our staff, including Jill and folks like Bruce, where certainly workforce and the conversation we had earlier is very relevant to these issues here, and ensure that those issues are part of this plan as well. And just as David said, it's important to note that to some degree, some of those issues are not in this present draft, so we just make note of that fact, and we plan to incorporate some of those issues, and a lot of those are policy-based, though. So we'll turn to the commission in our individual conversations to ensure that the regulations reflect the will of the commission. With that being said, we thought it would be helpful today for you to just take a look at the model we're working off of here. This is based upon a number of different other jurisdictions' models, both New Jersey and Ohio. There are some elements of Delaware baked in here. There's a lot of Mr. Acosta's expertise baked in here, and some other points that we brought in as a matter of Massachusetts law, looking at the statutes. Primarily, the statutes we're looking at are included in Chapter 23K. Section 30 is the primary licensing statute. It also makes reference to Sections 12 and 16, which deal with disqualification and unsuitability. We've made an effort to, at this stage, ensure that we kind of have placeholders here for all of the important subject matters. So that's what this draft reflects, and we can certainly go through it in any method you think would be helpful, or we can just walk through it section by section so you can get a sense as to what we've done here. And as Mr. Day mentioned, if possible, I think the hope would be to be able, at your next meeting next week, to be able to move this forward through the process, and that is have a draft that we're satisfied with, though understanding that it will be subject to public comment and further change as we move through the process. And the reason that's important is that given all of the statutory requirements in the public hearing process and the public notification process and the filing process with the Secretary of State's office, there are certain time periods that we need to recognize. And in order to have these regulations become effective by mid-January, we would need to have them really approved and signed off on in their initial stage anyway by next week. And that would allow us to have them in effect by January 17th. Those are our preliminary calculations. And as you'll recall from our past promulgation of regulations, the Secretary of State's office publishes the Massachusetts Register every 2 weeks. So we're working basically on 2-week blocks. Every 2 weeks, we put it off another 2 weeks until they could become effective. So with that in mind, we'd be happy to go through some of the regulations. We can flag some of the policy considerations we think the Commission will have to consider. Some of them you've already discussed, but we thought it would be helpful to have them here in written form so you can see what it would actually look like in regulation form. The first thing that we've done.
Can I ask something before that?
Sure.
In the timeline that you briefly summarized, are we allowing for public comment, not just what's required once they are published in the Central Register, but we've made a practice in the past of putting out a lot of our drafts in in our website for public comments early on. Is there any of that given some thought?
There has been, and I think our sense was that we would utilize the same practice the Commission has in the past, and that is, though we can't formally elicit public comment after November 7th if you were to vote, we would post the regulations on the Commission's website, allow people to submit comments. That would give people 5 weeks or so to submit written comments leading up to the public hearing, at which point people could come in and comment as well. Whether there'll be time after the public hearing to submit written comments, I don't think so, given the schedule we've discussed. We can talk about the schedule further. We can come up with a written proposal for you so you can see the timeframes, and we can adjust them, as I said, on those 2-week intervals if we think it would be helpful to allow for more time for public comment. But ultimately, I think there'll be a solid 5 weeks anyway for public comment on the initial draft.
That's what we've done in the past, isn't it?
That's right.
We haven't left it open after the public hearing for very long. Really, just the amount of time it takes us to turn it around, absorb the public comments that we agree with into the regulations and get them off to the Secretary of State. But this process that you're talking about will allow for plenty of comment.
I might add, as Director Griffin stated, their staff are still reaching out to stakeholder groups too in that process to continue to fine tune the document.
Right.
Thank you. And what about the other sections that are in this table of contents? We only have 134, the ones relative to licensing. Are we anticipating, and we'll get into the schedule probably as early as next week, but are we anticipating a rolling basis or a next block of the other regulations?
I think that's right, and I would defer to Mr. Day on this point, but I think the sense was we need to kind of move forward on a priority basis to ensure we're ready within the 6-month timeframe after the issuance of the license to get the process up and running. I think that the licensing regulations were identified as one of the key areas, and then certainly some of the others will be equally as key, and we'll start moving forward with those as well.
I just might add an example of that thought process, and we'll be able to discuss a little bit more as we do the critical path discussion. But with the 6 months possibility of a temporary facility, the standards, machine standards in that process, that means we've got to move that up, so that will be likely one of the next items that the commission sees to move forth through the formal process. Internal controls as a result of that process can probably move, but we want to make sure we get those things where we know that when the businesses are ready to open, that they can access the equipment they need to do business.
Thank you.
You have, again, not to dwell on this point about the table of contents, you have 2 sections for gaming equipment.
There is, yes, that could very well be if we've done that. Yeah, that was a mistake. This actually came together fairly quickly, so we're just trying to get everything in place. And there's definitely going to be typos and other stuff in here that needs attention. Some of the internal citations need to be tweaked. The numbering has changed a couple of times over the course of the past week. So we certainly recognize that it needs some editing. But the table of contents you referenced was just kind of a first shot at trying to figure out how this will all look. And as we draft it, it's helpful to be able to have numbers assigned to it so we can start getting the citations together. But obviously, we will only have one gaming equipment section.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. So we started
You're
off.
under salary today, Commissioner.
The late hour I was up, I want to make it sure everybody knows I'm still on top of my game. So.
Right. No, that was a good catch. We'll make a note. The first thing we've done here, well, the first thing I guess I would point out is that the approach that we took in the drafting process was to capture all of the types of licenses and regulations in under one section, as opposed to having a section for key gaming employees, a section for gaming employees, a section for gaming service employees, a section for vendors. Instead of doing that, what we've done, and this was an approach taken in New Jersey, was that they basically put it all under one umbrella, and they have a number of provisions that apply to each of those. So, and I'll explain a little more about what I mean by that as we walk through, but as you'll see in this section 134, we capture basically all of the areas in which licenses or registrations will have to be issued. So the first 5 or so sections identify all of those areas. They come in the form of the 3 employee type licenses and registrations, and that is key gaming employees, gaming employees, and gaming service employees. And then the vendors. There are 2 types of vendors. There are gaming vendors and non-gaming vendors. I'll point out one other area that we've called out that I think the commission will have to take a look at, and that is gaming vendor qualifiers. Those are essentially individuals who have influence and control over a gaming vendor. That's not specifically identified in the statute, but that's an area we thought that we would need to somehow recognize. And then finally, the labor organization.
Todd, excuse me 1 second. Are the labels showing on the website? The labels of who's speaking?
Sometimes, yes.
Okay, I haven't noticed them, but,
I put everyone in this one.
okay, just keep them going, because people come back and forth. Yeah.
So I'll just kind of start at the beginning. I'll make a few points. Certainly welcome any comments, or I can move quicker or slower, or however you think would be most helpful here. In the arena of gaming employee, and key gaming employee licenses, we've broken that down into 2 subsets. We have key qualifiers and then key, what do we call them? Just
keys.
Regular keys. And the distinction is one of title. And perhaps, maybe you can, David, just explain a little bit about why that distinction was made.
In last meeting, when we were discussing policy issues that, with respect to licensing, one of the concerns that we had, or one of the policies that we discussed, was what is it that the commission wants to review in a public meeting? And if I recall, Mr. Chairman McHugh, or Commissioner McHugh, I'm sorry, I gave you the wrong title.
Careful.
Chairman McHugh asked about considering just certain levels of keys. And I mentioned a practice in New Jersey where keys were actually separated in two categories, those that are key qualifiers, the real principal top-level individuals who actually need a license in order, because they are part of the payroll staff, and those that are keys necessary because of the operation. They're the supervisors of the security department at a particular ship, the security of the credit supervisors, anybody who can issue credit over $5,000. That's a bar that's been set. So we divided it into those areas modeled after New Jersey. The key qualifiers will be the ones that will be recommended for consideration before the commission at a public meeting. The keys will be done through the approval process that's established in 30G. And those individuals do not necessarily need to come before the commission for consideration.
So that's the distinction between the two types of keys. The other note I would just make here that I invite everyone to take a closer look at are the positions that we've identified as fitting under each of these categories. So we've made efforts, and this was an approach that the state of Ohio has taken, and we modified some of their classifications. But under each of these categories, we've actually listed the positions that would fit under there, as opposed to just going with a broad definition so people have to try to figure out where they fit. We've actually listed the positions there.
And I just want to emphasize that these are responsibilities, that if a person has the responsibility of what is commonly known as an audit manager, it requires a key. That doesn't mean that the title of that person has to be audit manager. It's the responsibilities that are generally associated with that title.
The next page, we talked about gaming employee licensees. That's our second category, where again, we've essentially identified folks who would require such a license. There are a few areas you'll observe that we've highlighted in here, and those are areas that were essentially put in as placeholders, these based upon some statutory references that we weren't able to quite wrap our arms around how we should word it, how it would fit in. We can talk a little bit more about that in the coming week, but some of the highlighted areas here deal with language that's included both in Section 30 and in the definitions of what a gaming employee is versus a gaming service employee. It's not necessarily a neat fit based upon some experiences David's had overseeing this process. We need to try to tighten up the definition so we're not either over-inclusive or under-inclusive, and that we kind of hit it in the sweet spot, while at the same time capturing what the statute talks about. So these are areas that need a little bit more work, and that's the reason we've highlighted them here. Gaming service employees, which is on page 5 of this draft, is basically the catch-all. It's essentially everyone who is not a key or a gaming employee and who works at the gaming establishment is a gaming service employee. So that's essentially the statutory definition, and that's what we talk about here. That's why there are no specific positions listed there.
So this includes everyone, and I was going to ask whether we need to define the gaming establishment or it really means everything. But the definition as you just described it would include food and beverage, housekeeping, parking attendants, etc.
Yes. Yes, that's correct.
And what we're asking about is that what we're generally saying they will be registered with the commission, all of those people, and would they need to be, what does the registration mean? Help me understand.
Registrant will still require the individual to file an application.
Yep.
To be credentialed, to meet a standard. The standard will be identified as a standard that is lower than a key or a gaming employee. We're recommending that a registrant, upon registration or within a short period of time, like 48 hours, they can commence employment. They will automatically be registered, and if it is discovered after registration that they have some questionable background and may not meet suitability, at that point, investigation or enforcement can initiate action to revoke a registration. But at a minimum, the individual will need to file an application. We will need to establish the person's identification. A person will be issued a credential. There is a nominal fee. We were suggesting that registration be for a period of 5 years, after which time they would have to re-register.
So a registrant is going to go through some sort of suitability examination?
I believe by statute, we're required to do that.
And what would that be?
And what would that be? Yeah, where is that?
What would be the requirement?
Yep,
In other words, what's the bar that they have to set?
yep.
That is subject of discussion. We met with a number of groups. There's been discussion as to whether or not they will be required to be fingerprinted. There's been discussion of not whether they need to have a credit background check. Even if we do obtain fingerprints and credit background, will they be used to determine suitability? There is some specific language in the statute that we must follow. These regulations, again, are reflected to that. So to ignore that they do not have to be investigated or meet certain standard would be ignoring some of the language that currently exists in the statute. And I know you're trying to say, where is the bar? Is the bar at 2 or 3, in a number sequence versus a 5? If I was to give a number sequence, the bar for a key would be a 10, the bar for a gaming employee would be a 5, but a registrant may be a 2.
What is 10, 5, and 2 mean in this
th-
context?
th- those-
Just a relative
Just the
comparison?
relative, just to give you some appreciation of the level of standards that we're looking at for these individuals to meet.
Right. Well, if it isn't obvious, this is certainly what the chairman was alluding to, not just Chairman Crosby or Chairman McHugh, but the chairman, they were both alluding to. They were both alluding to this other goal of,
There's no coup in Clark.
Well, I have a hard time living that one down.
one day we will all be chairmen and
Yeah,
women.
right.
Relative to the other goals of the statute, to providing, gainful employment to people who need it the most, and if we set that bar too high, whether it's a 2 relative to a 10, we may be too strict. So I'm really interested, we're all really interested in just fleshing out just what that registrant or requirements will be.
As Todd has indicated, I mean, these regulations, this is a first go-around, this is a first draft. And we're hoping that we can meet with you individually and together as staff to try to define this a little further. We have met with other groups already, and they have expressed that same concern to us. And we're trying to draft regulations that, at one hand, it comports with the what's in the statute, and at the same time to be cognizant of individuals who were intended to get employment. One of the things that I'm recommending is that registrant be allowed to commence employment right away, whereas gaming employees in Keys must go through an investigatory background check before they're deemed appropriate for licensure. There may be a process where they can get a temporary license, but unlike registrant, which is done right away, they can commence employment. You know, that's one step that we're hoping would address or alleviate some of the concerns with respect to registrants.
Right. No, I look forward to those discussions, and I myself need to go back to those particular sections of the statute. But when we first talked about registrants, I, perhaps wrongly, had in my mind that people would just register, not be the subject to a background investigation. And I understand the nuances, but which is why I look forward to these discussions.
So you do plan to put into the regs what the standards are? Is that going to be in the regs?
There is a section that talks about this that we'll get to in a moment. It's difficult to capture the 10, 5, and 2 concept that David was talking about. So where we'll probably have to capture it is in what information we require, what's going to be in the application, what we're going to check. For example, the statute talks about disqualification for certain criminal offenses, even for gaming service employees. So of course, the natural extension of that is that we have to check people's corals. So there are some minimum things we have to do. Credit checks is obviously a big issue that everyone talks about. That's, I think subject to your discretion, whether that's something we want to do or not. One of the messages we've tried to put out there, at least in some of our discussions, is that just because we check something doesn't necessarily, and because you may have something, doesn't necessarily mean you'll be excluded from being issued a license or registration. Sometimes you may decide that it'll be helpful to check things so we can gauge where the needle is and when you're disqualified or when you're not disqualified. Or we may decide that we don't even want to check certain things for certain people. And that's really going to be the issue we have to take a look at here. So that's captured in here in a later section that we'll get to in a moment. But that's really the most difficult part of this whole thing, is figuring out where the line is for the different licensees and registrants.
Well, but we have to figure that out. We can't just have a, we'll gather all this information and then we'll make up our minds kind of approach to this, right? So hard as it is, we've got to come up with the qualification requirements and lay them out.
Yeah, I totally agree with that, but I wasn't sure what the answer to the question was. Are you planning on proposing regs that will set out the standards? Is that where we will come to grips with these issues?
Well, we can, and that seems to be...
Well, it has to be somewhere. It's got to be somewhere.
Well,
Whether it's,
right now, basically, the rule is just there has to be clear and convincing evidence that you meet the requirements of the statute. That's kind of a broad approach to this. We haven't found, and I'm not aware of any other jurisdictions that kind of make that distinction in writing. So that's the difficult.
What distinction?
Well, being able to kind of capture this discussion in a regulation.
But it seems to me that we have to, if we're going to have different, we have to have a regulation that says something like, in order to be registered as a key qualifier, you have to meet requirements A, B, and C. In order to be registered as a key, you have to meet requirements C, D, and F. And we can't have a regulatory scheme that simply gathers in all this information and then we'll decide whether you qualify. The statutory piece is a baseline, but that can be reflected in the regulation. But what we want to add on top of that, it seems to me, has to be in the regulation as well. I think, and I think it has to be there not only to let the public know, and educators and screeners and people in the workforce development side be able to look at something and help guide people in their efforts to move forward. But if a registration is denied or a license is denied, and somebody takes an appeal, the appellant, the body to whom it's appealed, has to know what standards it's applying and whether the evidence meets the standard or not. So, hard as it is, I think we really need to do that.
How do other jurisdictions decide who gets registered or not?
I understand that this is not that simple. It's hard to put all of this in black and white because with every case, there are extenuating circumstances that we may need to consider. And that's with employment in every occupation, especially those that require background checks. So I hear what you're saying. It's very hard to put it in writing, everything that we will consider. And, but I agree, we do need basic standards. People have to know the disqualifiers, for example.
Right.
That's critical. And, but to put everything in writing is basically impossible. If you have, I could give you example after example of areas that you consider alarming, or because of the number of events that may have occurred in someone's background, and they may not be convictions. So it's hard to quantify what is the standard.
Well, that, quite frankly, is precisely the kind of thing that I'm concerned about. I think whether and to what extent we consider arrests, for example, is a policy decision. Whether an arrest for shoplifting is going to be different from an arrest for attempted murder, just to take two possible examples. If we are going to do that kind of thing, then we ought to say something about how we're going to deal with arrests. We may not be able to set out what the criteria are, i.e. you're arrested for attempted murder, you can't get a license, shoplifting is okay, but we ought to have some piece of the regulation that says arrests will be considered in the following fashion, or we're not going to consider arrests without a conviction. Otherwise, particularly when we're trying to attract people from the underemployed communities and to create a diverse group and encourage diversity, allowing a lot of discretion or appearing to allow a lot of discretion is going to be a counterforce in the entire effort, it seems to me.
I agree. We are, however, guided by what the statute includes. So Section
No
16,
question.
Section 16 talks about some of the disqualifiers.
Right.
And some of them are fairly open-ended. And one of them talks about whether someone has committed prior acts which have not been prosecuted, or in which the applicant was not convicted, which would seemingly go to the issue you just talked about. So I suppose the commission could decide that we're not going to, I don't know. I mean, that's something we have to talk about. I mean, the statute would seem to suggest that we do have to look at everything.
I'm not quarreling with that. We have to look at that, but that's precisely the kind of really open-ended statutory mandate that regulations are designed to clarify, so that to the extent it can be clarified, and you can't, I think, have a laundry list of every act conceivable, that some are okay, some are not okay, but at least what criteria we're going to use when it comes time to implement that broad and open-ended statutory mandate. I think we can do that, and I think we need to do that, to confine our discretion in ways that are intelligible, even though the regulation can't be entirely precise.
Yeah,
To pick up on that, David, in your experience in New Jersey and Ohio, have you ever seen a situation where you work with a potential applicant to see whether their internal hiring policies mirror or follow a statute, so that there's no confusion between what a regulatory body is requiring and what the operator is requiring?
In both states, we would meet with employers and set some parameters as to this would be a disqualifying offense, this would not be a disqualifying offense. This would be an offense that may require review, may be determined at a hearing, because the offense are not so clear, and there's some, further investigation that may need. In both states, through the hearing process, there was an establishment of past practice of case law that was used in future cases. How do we consider an arrest that occurred 10 years ago or prior to 10 years ago for this offense? But it was dismissed because of some, procedural reason. Does that make a person suitable? Those were all kind of decisions that were made through a hearing officer. It was heard and it was brought before the commission. It was decided from that point on forward. Anybody with similar, in a similar situation would then meet this test. I mean, here, we're new, we haven't established that. Obviously, we can go back to the other states and see how they dealt with some of these cases and try to come up with something. But yes, once we established that, we did meet on a regular basis with the employers to try to ensure that the workforce was reflective of what's required in both statute and regulation.
To Commissioner McHugh's point about, the focus of the statute being on encouraging hiring of unemployed and underemployed individuals, obviously through the recent years in the economic times, some people have leveraged their financial resources or lack thereof. So, I mean, when we sit down and chat, I'm going to be keeping an eye towards individual's credit situation. I mean, we're trying to help pull some people out of adverse financial conditions, but I would think those may have some more,
In New Jersey,
they might be more tight than maybe some of the other criminal issues or legal issues that an applicant might face.
my experience in New Jersey and Ohio was that a credit score was not a reason to prohibit a person from being issued a registration or a gaming license. It came more into question respect to an individual who was applying for a key. But for those two levels, credit scores did not. However, in New Jersey, for registrants and even gaming employees, if an individual had an outstanding debt of child support, that had an arrearages above a certain limit, let's say $1,500 in arrearages, they would get a registrant or a license with the condition that they would affirmatively address those debts.
David, excuse me, because this is, I don't think we want to be talking about the particulars at this point. What you're talking about now is exactly what we're talking about. What are the standards that people can know up front, and exactly the kinds of things you're talking about. And I think we've made it clear that we have to do this as best we possibly can, understanding there's going to be some discretion, there's going to be gray areas, but and Jill, you need to be involved. You and your people need to be right involved in this. There's going to be no more critical place that will determine the extent to which we can meet this public policy objective than in these regs. So you and your advisors need to be right into this conversation. So I think we've made the point that we need to define what are the standards as best we possibly can in our regs as part of this exercise. We can debate where the line should fall once you guys give us some drafts, but we can't debate that we need to try to do this.
Well, and I think, Todd, they have taken a first shot at that 13410, page 27. So I think it provides a structure to move forward from that point as we continue our discussions with regarding the standards. And I understand what the chairman's saying. I think the difficulty is really from the application through my years on the licensing side too is you're really looking at the whole person, particularly in some areas. So we have discussion about arrest. So one arrest, as the licensing agent is sitting down to take a look at it, they're going to apply the standards, what's reflected in the codes and what the goals are. You may have one arrest and 2 arrests, maybe nothing else. But on the other hand, you may have something where you have a credit report that says the individual has $200,000 debt problem, reported to all the credit agencies. Possibly they'll have 3, 4, 5 arrests, no conviction for theft. May have some other judgments we've identified on top of them. When you look at that whole record then as you're applying these standards, then that may very well pose an increased risk to the operation of the gaming establishment. So that's where I think, I do think as we work on 13410, we
Yeah, I
can
see
come
that.
forward with some more even, I don't know if I call them guidelines, but some broader terms. So the key is, I think, from the commission's aspect, to develop those terms that serves to guide those kind of decisions, but to also allow that flexibility in being able to weigh that entire person's history as opposed to just one thing. Obviously, there's disqualifiers, but
Yeah.
Well,
No, I agree with that.
And I know the hearings in New Jersey, a lot of them, 8, 10 domestic violences, charges get dropped in those cases, but do you want to consider the amount, the severity, those were the kinds of hearings that I know, it's hard to put that in black and white.
correct. That's a particular area that's very challenging in this process.
Okay. I think the first answer to the questions we've been asking should have been 13410 is a significant step in this direction. I mean, this is the right direction. And there is some serious content at 13410. So anyway, I think enough on this topic, I think.
Okay. So we were on page 6.
Yeah. Tell Janice, go get some lunch.
No, that was really the meat of the conversation. As I mentioned, I think that is the trickiest part of this whole thing, is figuring out what the standard is, because everything else is fairly administrative and mechanical, and that will be the trick. So in any event, we have the vendor sections, and as with the employee sections, we've attempted to identify which people who perform certain services would fit into which category. As you recall, the statute talks about folks who provide perhaps non-gaming services, but who provide a certain amount of business or do a certain amount of business with a gaming establishment, switching into the gaming vendor category. We capture those folks here. There has been, it's been pointed out that there may be a typo in the statute, and that's why we've highlighted the word we have there. The statute talks about an entity that conducts over $250,000 of business with a gaming licensee within a 12-month period, or conducts over $100,000 of business with a gaming licensee within, it says a 3-year period in the statute. We thought perhaps it's supposed to say a month, which is why we highlighted that. So we have to talk about that as well.
Well, are we keeping a file of legislative fix things? Remember, way back, the consultants in their original strategic plan had a bunch of proposed legislative fixes, and we've been reluctant to do anything about legislative fixes because the legislature is reluctant to reopen this. But there may be a time when we do want to file legislation that does things like that, at least. So we ought to keeping a particular file somewhere of, if the time comes, we want to file legislation to clean up things like this, to remember what they are.
Right. There's actually one other area that I'll point out in a moment that I'd like to draw your attention to along those lines. But one of the other things we captured in here is the labor organization registration. We hadn't initially talked about that, but this in part comes from the state of New Jersey. It also captures what Chapter 23K talks about. So we have a section on labor organizations, and it's just a registration piece.
Can I go back to just briefly, non-gaming vendors, is there a threshold for non-gaming vendors? In other words, $10 makes, of a business makes somebody a non-gaming vendor?
Yes.
Anyone who
Does.
does business.
Anyone who does
Anybody.
business, yes. And there's just a basic registration, there will be just a basic registration form with a copy of the agreement, and we will then monitor the level of business, and if they reach the thresholds as described above, then at that point, we will notify them that you've reached this threshold, and you would then need to qualify as a gaming vendor.
That would be a
Okay, so
registration.
it's the volume that takes you from being non-gaming to gaming, whether or not you're actually working in the gaming facility. Is that right?
That's right, if you're working in the gaming facility.
Right.
No, I took it, well, I actually took it differently. I guess it may be both, but I took the discipline to be non-gaming vendor. So,
You
so if
took-
you're a garbage handler and you do $1 million worth of business, are you a non-gaming vendor or a gaming vendor?
You'll be a gaming vendor.
Oh,
Right. F and G,
yep.
yeah, on the next page. F and G, these make you, pull you out of this.
Regardless of the
Regardless of where you do business or what your business is. If you're a flower supplier and you only supply flowers to the hotel, if you do $250,000 a year, you're a gaming vendor. Right? That makes sense to me. I mean, that was a good way to do that from my standpoint.
That's not how I understood it, but I'm glad I asked the question.
Am I right? That's what you're saying?
That-
That
Yeah,
was my understanding.
Yeah, okay.
I guess it would be worthy of note as to what this does not cover, and that is employees of the vendors. And this has come up in the context of construction companies, most specifically. This does not, with the exception of perhaps the qualifiers of a construction company to the extent they're doing over $250,000 in business, which presumably many of them would. The people on site, building in the trades and whatnot, would not be required to be licensed or registered in any way, as long as the vendor is. So I think that's just important to point out here. On page 8, we have a section set aside for junket enterprises and junket representatives. There is, of course, a statute that governs that. Junket representatives are covered under the gaming employee section. By statute, they're considered gaming employees. Junket enterprises, we classify as gaming vendors. But there are specific requirements for junkets as well that we intended to capture in this section.
I just want to make one thing clear. The junket representative could be an individual who's employed by the casino licensee. It could also mean a junket representative who's employed by the junket enterprise. So when looking at this, we need to consider, is the junket representative employed by the casino licensee or by the junket enterprise? And we'll try to work that in to make sure that that's clear.
The next section is the form section, and this takes up the bulk of this draft here. And the intent here is to be able to set out each application that will ever have to be filed here for every position, and articulate what information will be contained in it. And I think some, harkening back to the last discussion about the standards, some of that will have to be captured here, what will be required in the applications themselves. So there's intended to be an application here for every position. And this we'll have to look at carefully too. This is, some of this is taken from our existing regs. Of course, we have a multi-state personal history disclosure form and a supplement. So those will be similar. I don't know if we made any tweaks on that, but then there'll be a form for gaming service, employee registrations, vendor, non-gaming vendor registrations, et cetera.
Is there any need to ask an applicant to give us the name, address, and occupation and phone numbers of people who are happy to talk about how wonderful they are.
References?
Yeah.
I guess that's a policy decision, there's no requirement.
I've been lobbying to get rid of that references thing. You know, it's absurd. We ask for 3 references from the people we're investigating. Every single qualifying report, background report I've read, the 3 people say the person is wonderful. You know, it's ridiculous. It's a waste of time, you know, so. It's too late to get them out of the application form for the licensees, but we can certainly get it out here. And if we want to get references that are independently found, that's a whole different story, but the way we've done it in the past is utterly pointless.
Well,
I think
it's not
references-
always, it's not, never mind.
I think references are only being asked from the multi-jurisdiction application. I don't believe that we included that in the other applications, and that application is one that's being used by multiple jurisdictions.
Right.
So I don't know,
Well, we do ask for the Massachusetts supplemental form. It's down there too.
I mean, we can take that one out.
It's just a pet peeve for me. I just
Is
think,
it? I've actually learned a lot from
I have too.
references.
I have too.
Yes.
I have too.
But I ask probing questions.
well, you're calling
No,
the
I'm,
references
I mean,
yourself.
seriously, they'll tell you about the operation and more about the subject matter, more about the person.
Have you read a section within our background reports that you thought was useful in the reference checks?
Well, I'm talking about personally conducting reference checks.
No, that's a whole
right?
different story. That's
Okay,
I'm
you're just
talking-
talking about reading a letter?
I'm just talking about the ones that are called for in our standard forms. It asks for 3 references, and they're in the background reports that
Yeah,
you get.
okay.
No, references, under the right circumstances, is totally valuable. But the way we do it in our standard forms, in the multi-jurisdictional personal form, and I guess also in the supplement, is to simply go talk to the 3 people that the in-person gives us, and then write that up. And the ones that I've read are a waste of time, but it's no point in beating this horse. I mean, I don't care whether they're in there or not. I just don't read them, that's all.
Along those lines, though, certainly everything we ask for should be asked for a reason and should be meaningful. So I think it is certainly worthwhile to go through everything we say is going to be in the forms. to
Yeah,
make sure there's a
I agree.
reason.
I agree.
And if a person who can't come up with 3, you know, that's a signal.
It's a red flag.
You'd be surprised how often we discover that.
Really?
How people will be coming in new to this country, and I don't have any friends or whatever. I always used to ask them if they had a cell phone, and if they did, do you have 3 contacts in there? Put those 3.
All right, just fast forwarding, we'll go over to page 25. Real quick, talks about the submission of the application, what has to be included. We talked about the fact that you have to include a form from the section we just talked about. You have to include a photograph, fingerprinting, so we'll have to go through and figure out which categories we want to require fingerprinting for. Identification documentation, we have a section coming up that goes through how you prove your identity, the fee, and then number 6 here on page 25 talks about proof of an offer of employment from a gaming licensee pending licensure or registration of the applicant. That's one of the policy considerations that came up. That was put in there as a placeholder. There are a number of states. In fact, I would even say perhaps a majority of states, though I haven't done a full survey of every state, but it seems like everyone I look at seems to have a provision like that in there, so this would not be unique. It is certainly a way to filter out some of the applications at the beginning of the process anyway, and perhaps we look to pull back on that as we move forward, but that's something that warrants further attention, for sure.
I thought we already, I'm sorry.
It's okay, you first.
No, I thought we already decided that.
Well, my recollection of the conversation was that we did kind of get there, and then we kind of took a right-hand turn at the very end, and it wasn't clear. I'm not going to identify which commissioner.
But you're looking at me.
We're looking at the right-hand side.
Speaking of the right.
Taking the right-hand turn and you.
So anyway, I think it's still on the table for discussion. And there it is.
Okay, I had a couple of questions with regard to this topic. First thing, the fees. We talked about the fees, and I know the last time you had fees before us, there was a laundry list of fees from every jurisdiction, and they were significantly different. How did we decide on some of the fees listed here, or are those not final decisions? I was looking at page,
So 30?
Yeah, page 30.
yes, where we had, $1,000 application, we had $4,000, the amount of the fee shall not exceed $4,000 with, so there was a couple of fees in here, and I just wondered where we came down on,
This was actually me and my past experience.
okay.
And actually, since this was drafted, we've had a number of conversations. For example, not to exceed the 4,000 may be something that we're going to come back and take out and just simply say it's a $1,000 deposit and you'll be billed for anything that's additional. Like I said last time, the state of Ohio set a particular fee for a category because they were by statute unable to bill.
I see.
State of New Jersey was able to, by statute, able to identify a deposit and then establish that they will be billed for any additional costs. The other fees for service registration and employees is based on my experience, and also looking at the chart and see what it costs in other states. And again, it's my recommendation.
Okay. I
Obviously, it's subject
assume
to-
these were your best practices, things that you thought were appropriate based on your licensing experience.
Correct.
The other question I had was with regard to CGIS and fingerprinting. We initially had problems here because we didn't have our own portal, even though we are a law enforcement agency. We were relying on the state police and their portal, and there were meetings with the FBI. I just don't know if we've resolved, and you may not know this, have we resolved some of those issues that we're easily able to access the systems we need to get that information back in a timely manner?
That's still in the works.
Okay.
I have reached out to a company from Ohio that provided those services, the actual fingerprint machines
Yeah.
and the service, the software to connect.
The live
to-
scan?
The live scan to connect to the, to FBI and to the state level. And I've asked to get some costs.
Okay.
So that we can make some recommendations and also meet with the enforcement people and the state police here to figure out how that works.
Okay.
But that's something that we're currently working on.
Thank you.
Page 26 is also an important piece of the scheme here. And this talks about how the licenses and registrations will be issued, by whom they will be issued, and what involvement the commission wants to have. So this is a section that needs some fine-tuning, without a doubt. But this is where we will address how the licenses physically get issued. The statute talks about some of this stuff, but it doesn't take us the whole way there. So we've broken it down into the keys and the separate licenses because we may take a separate approach depending on the type of license it is. And as David mentioned, we split up the types of keys into two types in anticipation of the fact that the commission may want to have more of an active role in the formal issuance of a license to key qualifiers versus regular keys, and perhaps even with gaming employees. So we need to talk about what level of involvement that we think is appropriate for the commission versus the issuance of the license by whether it's the Bureau or the Division of Licensing. And as David mentioned also, in paragraph 2 here on page 26, we added in the provision he mentioned earlier, which is that a gaming service employee registrant will be issued the registration upon essentially completion of the applications, subject to revocation if anything comes up in whatever level of background check form, which would allow individuals in that category to get to work immediately, as opposed to having to wait for word from the commission. So that's a policy consideration that is before you as well. That's not a done deal. That's not set out in statute or anything along those lines.
Using Jennifer Durenberger's word, are these proposed standards of review harmonized with the racing division's standards of review for the various kinds of issues that come before them and hearing officers?
I can answer that question.
Okay.
They are not. And the racing division will, I think, be looking for this information to help them strengthen what's done now.
Okay. So,
That's an area that needs work with
Okay.
regard to racing.
so your think is that what we decide here would help inform how to
Yes.
fix, okay, fine.
Yes.
I thought it might be the other way around, but okay, good.
So over the course of the next week, I think we'll have to kind of distill the direction the commission wants to go with reference to the final issuance of the license for the separate categories. We will also have to take a look at the hearing process and how that will work. There are hearing regs in place in the present version of the commission's regulations that we should just take a look at to make sure that that is the manner in which you'd want to go. We presently say that these hearings have to be conducted in accordance with the formal rules. We should just kind of review that to see if that's the way you want to keep it, or whether we want to move into the informal rules or what have you. But that's why that's highlighted there in the middle of page 27. And then again, as we've discussed earlier, 134.10 talks about the affirmative standards. That's where we'd have to build in any different standards for different types of licenses or what have you. I would just draw your attention to a couple of things. It's in paragraph B. I'm still on page 27 at the bottom. A number of those items in the list come right out of the statute. I think it's section 12. They're the same for the gaming licensees. They also apply to the other types of licensees. They're referenced in section 30. But we actually added a few onto the list there. One of the ways we can consider looking at some of these prior bad acts, if you will, is by inclusion of this number 6 discusses convictions for crimes of moral turpitude. That's not anywhere in the statute. That's something we added in there for your consideration. Certainly, we would have to be clear on what we mean by a crime of moral turpitude, but that is something we wanted to put on the table to talk about. Because otherwise, the statute only talks about convictions for felonies and then crimes related to things like embezzlement, theft, and perjury. So that excludes, obviously, everything else.
Is this section 134.10, does it apply to key employees, keys, and service employees? In other words, everybody?
As it's presently written, it does, but that's something we need to talk about, is whether it should, or whether there's some other approach we should take for registrants, for example.
Yeah, maybe from my earlier point and a lot of the discussion, we may need to tier that differently, or at least break it down into the 3 groups that we have, to the extent that they're different. And I think there's some
that's right.
areas.
This is where we would do it, right? in
Yep.
this section. We talk about, on the next page, rehabilitation. I think this is an important point as well. This gets into one of the areas that has come up a number of times in discussion. It's in section 16 of chapter 23K, where it talks about reasons why the commission has to deny a license. It talks about the rehabilitation, demonstrated rehabilitation for certain convictions. And this section of, it's section 16B, talks about the 10-year look-back period. It only applies to gaming employees and gaming service employees. It does not apply to key gaming employees. So the read from that would be that a key gaming employee who has been convicted of certain crimes is not able to demonstrate rehabilitation for any of that. where a gaming service employee or a gaming employee could demonstrate rehabilitation. One of the areas of inconsistency, just to get back to one of the points you made, Mr. Chairman, about possible inconsistencies with the statute, is that in section 16 it says that the commission shall deny a license for anyone who's been convicted of certain crimes, and it allows, though, to, as I just mentioned, for the demonstration of rehabilitation for crimes that occurred more than 10 years ago. Whereas in section 30, it talks about rehabilitation, but it doesn't have a limitation on A, who can petition, and B, for what period of time. So we need to take a close look at that to the extent we wanted to allow for rehabilitation for categories of crimes that don't fit within the 10-year thing. There may be a window to do that, but it'll all come down to the commission's read of the statute. So I'll be able to point that out to you a little more closely, perhaps on an individual level, but I just wanted to point that out. And then we have sections for fingerprinting, identification. These are all based upon the methods used in other jurisdictions. We have a fee section that we will tighten up a little bit just to clarify what the fees and the renewal fees are. We have the terms of licenses on page 32. Again, that's something we need to take a look at. There are only a handful of areas where the statute sets out what the term of the license or registration shall be when it comes to vendors. I think they say it has to be 3 years, but otherwise, I think the commission has a great deal of discretion. I think in your previous policy discussions, you said that you wanted all the licenses to be 3 years, and that you'd revisit the renewals at a later time. So we just put in 3 years for everything. And then at the end, it's starting on page 34, we put in draft disciplinary and hearing provisions just for you to take a look at. As it presently stands, there may be some conflict between this and what exists in your present regulations, so we obviously need to make sure that those are aligned, but this is one way to go about doing it. There are other models that follow this approach as well. And that basically sums up where we are with these draft regulations on license.
It's great. It's a good
Great
job.
start.
Yeah.
Great start.
Good job. You finished? Director, we'll take a little quick break. Come back in 5 minutes or so.